The distant wail of coyotes carried on the night wind as Fiona Davenport clutched her mother's silver locket, the only possession she'd managed to salvage from the inferno that had devoured everything she loved. The year was 1876, and the small frontier settlement of Jerome, Arizona Territory, had turned its back on her just when she needed it most. The orange glow of dawn crept over the horizon, illuminating the blackened ruins of what had once been her family's general store and home. 3 days had passed since the fire, and Fiona had spent each night huddled against the charred remains of the back wall, where a small portion of the structure remained standing. Her honey-brown hair hung in tangles around her face, streaked with soot and grime. At 22, she had already weathered more than her share of hardships, but none compared to this desolation. "Should have known better than to trust that oil lamp," she muttered to herself, voice raspy from smoke and thirst. The town's whispers had reached her ears even as the embers still glowed rumors that she had been careless, that the fire had started because of her negligence while her parents were away visiting her ailing aunt in Prescott. The accusations stung worse than her raw, blistered hands. One by one, the townsfolk who had once greeted her warmly at church socials and town gatherings had averted their eyes when they passed. No offers of shelter, no comforting words, only judgment and the occasional pitying glance quickly masked by indifference. Fiona pushed herself to her feet, wincing as her body protested. She had been surviving on water from the horse trough and the few scraps of food left by a sympathetic child who'd snuck away from his mother's watchful eye. Her once fine dress, a gift from her father for her last birthday, hung in tatters around her slender frame. "Miss Davenport," the deep voice startled her, and she spun around, nearly losing her balance on weak legs. There before her stood a tall figure silhouetted against the rising sun. As he stepped closer, she recognized the broad-shouldered frame of Caleb Zimmerman, owner of the Double Z ranch that sprawled across the valley several miles outside of town. She'd seen him occasionally in the general store, exchanging terse greetings with her father as he purchased supplies. He'd always struck her as intimidating with his towering height and the quiet intensity that seemed to radiate from him. At around 30, he was older than the young men who sometimes attempted to court her, and unlike them, he never lingered to make small talk. "Mr. Zimmerman," she acknowledged, trying to summon what dignity she could despite her disheveled appearance. She pulled her tattered shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I've been away on business in Tucson," he said, his voice carrying a hint of gentleness she'd never heard before. "Just returned last night and heard about what happened." His blue eyes, the color of a summer sky, took in her pitiful state, but there was no judgment in them. Fiona turned away, unable to bear his scrutiny. "I'm managing fine," she lied. He stepped closer, and she noticed he was leading his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion. Draped across the saddle were several woolen blankets. "No one should have to sleep in the ashes of their own home," he said simply, offering the blankets to her. "These aren't much, but they'll keep you warmer than that shawl." Fiona hesitated, pride warring with desperate need. "I don't need charity, Mr. Zimmerman." "It's not charity, Miss Davenport. It's human decency." He extended the blankets again, and this time she took them, the soft wool feeling like heaven against her chapped fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Have you eaten today?" he asked, his gaze steady. She looked away, unwilling to admit the truth. "I thought as much," he said, reaching into his saddlebag to produce a cloth-wrapped bundle. "It's just some bread and jerky, nothing fancy." The aroma of fresh baked bread made her stomach clench painfully, reminding her how long it had been since she'd had a proper meal. This time, she accepted his offering without protest. As she ate, Caleb surveyed the ruins of the store, his expression grim. "Where are your parents?" "Visiting my aunt in Prescott," she replied between careful bites, trying not to eat too quickly. "They don't know yet." "Telegraph office said the lines are down after the storm last week." "And no one in town offered you shelter?" His voice held a dangerous edge. Fiona swallowed hard. They believe I caused the fire through carelessness. Caleb's jaw tightened. And did you? No, she answered firmly, meeting his gaze directly. I've been working in that store since I was 12. I know how to handle a lamp safely. She looked down at her hands. But no one believes me. They think I was reading late and fell asleep. He was silent for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to read the truth there. Finally, he nodded once. I believe you, Miss Davenport. Those 4 simple words nearly broke her. After days of accusations and cold shoulders, someone finally believed her. Fiona fought back tears, determined not to weep in front of this man who had shown her more kindness in 10 minutes than the entire town had in 3 days. You can't stay here, Caleb said, his tone brooking no argument. My ranch has plenty of room. You'll have a proper bed, hot meals, and safety until your parents return. Fiona stiffened. That wouldn't be proper, Mr. Zimmerman. A young woman staying alone with an unmarried man, my housekeeper, Mrs. Rivera, lives at the ranch with her husband, who serves as my foreman. There's also a cook and several ranch hands. You wouldn't be alone with me. His lips curved slightly. Your reputation would remain intact, Miss Davenport. She hesitated, weighing her options. Pride told her to refuse, but common sense argued loudly against spending another night in the open with only blankets for protection. I'd be working for my keep, she insisted. I'm not looking for handouts, Caleb nodded. Mrs. Rivera could use help with the household chores. It's a fair arrangement. After a moment's consideration, Fiona nodded. Very well, Mr. Zimmerman. I accept your offer, but only until my parents return or until I can make other arrangements. Of course. He extended his hand to help her up onto his horse. Do you have anything you need to bring with you? Fiona glanced back at the ruins of her home, a lump forming in her throat. Just this, she said, touching the silver locket at her neck. Everything else is gone. Caleb's eyes softened with understanding. Without further comment, he helped her mount his horse, then swung up behind her. The solid warmth of his chest against her back was both alarming and comforting as they rode away from Jerome, the morning sun casting long shadows before them. As they rode, Fiona gazed out over the vast landscape of the Arizona Territory. Red rock formations rose majestically against the clear blue sky, and in the distance, the San Francisco Peak stood sentinel over the high desert plateau. The beauty of it all seemed at odds with the hollowness inside her. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch, Caleb said, his deep voice rumbling against her back. Are you comfortable enough? Yes, thank you, she replied, though in truth she was acutely aware of his proximity. The propriety her mother had instilled in her since childhood warned that this situation was highly improper, yet circumstances had left her little choice. You mentioned you were in Tucson on business, she said, seeking distraction from her discomfort. What sort of business, if you don't mind my asking? Cattle, he replied. Negotiating a deal to supply beef to the army at Fort Lowell. It should mean steady income for the ranch over the next year. That sounds promising. It is. The Double Z has grown considerably in the past 5 years. Started with just 50 head of cattle and a run-down cabin. Now we're up to over 500 head and a proper ranch house. There was no boasting in his tone, just a simple statement of fact, but Fiona couldn't help being impressed. She knew from her father's business dealings that ranching was a precarious venture in this territory, with drought, rustlers, and fluctuating cattle prices all threatening a man's livelihood. You've accomplished a great deal, Mr. Zimmerman. Caleb, he corrected gently. If you're going to be staying at my ranch, we might as well dispense with formalities. Then you must call me Fiona, she replied, finding it easier to breathe now that they were putting distance between themselves and Jerome. The trail wound through stands of ponderosa pine and across rocky arroyos. As they crested a rise, Caleb pointed to a distant valley where a cluster of buildings stood beside a small creek lined with cottonwood trees. There it is, Double Z Ranch. Even from a distance, Fiona could see that it was impressive, a two-story main house built of sturdy logs with a wide porch, several outbuildings, corrals, and a large barn. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth within. As they approached, activity around the ranch became visible. A man was shoeing a horse outside the barn, while another drove a wagon loaded with hay toward a distant pasture. A woman emerged from the main house, shaking out a rug. "That's Mrs. Rivera," Caleb explained. "She's been with me since I built the place. Mexican woman married to my foreman, Miguel. Best cook this side of the Mississippi, though don't tell her I said so. Her head's big enough as it is." There was affection in his voice, and Fiona found herself curious about this man who had appeared like a guardian angel when she needed one most. What had brought him to this territory? Why had he chosen this lonely life so far from town? The woman on the porch spotted them approaching and shaded her eyes against the morning sun. As they rode into the yard, she hurried down the steps. "Señor Caleb, you've returned early, and with a guest." Her dark eyes took in Fiona's bedraggled appearance with concern. Caleb dismounted and helped Fiona down from the horse. "Mrs. Rivera, this is Miss Fiona Davenport from Jerome. There was a fire that destroyed her family's store and home. She'll be staying with us until her parents return from Prescott." Mrs. Rivera's expression immediately softened with compassion. "Dios mío, the poor child. Come inside right away. You need food, a bath, and clean clothes." She took Fiona's arm gently, clucking like a mother hen. "So thin." "Don't worry, we will take good care of you." Fiona found herself whisked into the house before she could properly thank Caleb. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, with polished wood floors, substantial furniture, and colorful woven rugs that added warmth to the rooms. "Señor Caleb is a good man," Mrs. Rivera confided as she led Fiona upstairs. "Very private, very serious, but his heart is kind, not like those people in town who gossip and judge." She made a dismissive gesture with her hand. "We mind our own business here." The bedroom Mrs. Rivera showed her to was simply furnished but clean and pleasant, with a large window overlooking the creek and mountains beyond. A handmade quilt in vibrant colors covered the bed, and fresh wildflowers stood in a pottery vase on the dresser. "This will be your room," Mrs. Rivera said. "I will bring hot water for your bath and find you some clean clothes. They may not fit perfectly. They belonged to Señor Caleb's sister when she visited last summer, but they will be better than these." She gestured to Fiona's tattered dress. "Mrs. Rivera, I don't know how to thank you." The older woman waved away her gratitude. "No thanks needed. Now you rest while I prepare everything." Left alone, Fiona sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. Just hours ago, she had been preparing to face another day of hunger and isolation among the ruins of her home. Now she found herself in a comfortable bedroom, about to enjoy a hot bath and clean clothes. For the first time since the fire, she allowed herself to cry, not from despair, but from relief and gratitude for the unexpected kindness of a man she barely knew. The next few days passed in a blur as Fiona adjusted to life at the Double Z. True to her word, she insisted on earning her keep, helping Mrs. Rivera with cooking, cleaning, and mending. The work was familiar enough. She'd performed similar tasks at home, but the surroundings and people were new. Caleb himself remained something of a mystery. He was often away from the house, riding out at dawn to check on cattle, fences, and water sources, returning only as dusk settled over the land. When their paths did cross, he was unfailingly polite but maintained a certain distance that left Fiona both relieved and oddly disappointed. On her fourth evening at the ranch, Fiona was setting the dining table when Caleb entered the house, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. His tall frame filled the doorway, and for a moment she found herself staring at him. The setting sun streaming through the windows caught in his dark hair, highlighting strands of copper she hadn't noticed before. "Miss Davenport," he greeted her with a nod. "I trust you're settling in well." "Very well, thank you," she replied, straightening the silverware with nervous fingers. Everyone has been most kind." He moved to the sideboard where a pitcher of water sat beside a basin. Rolling up his sleeves, he washed the dust from his hands and face. Fiona couldn't help noticing the powerful muscles of his forearms, tanned from long days in the sun. "I sent one of my men to Prescott yesterday," he said, drying his hands on a towel. "He should return tomorrow or the next day with news of your parents." Fiona's heart leapt with hope and anxiety. "Thank you, I've been so worried about them." It was no trouble. He turned to face her fully, and she noticed a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there before. "I also had him inquire about the fire." She stilled, her hand pausing over a plate. "What do you mean?" "Something about your story didn't sit right with me." "Fires happen, but the way the town turned against you so quickly." He shook his head. "It felt wrong." "You think there's more to it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb's blue eyes held her steadily. "I don't know, but I intend to find out." Before she could respond, Mrs. Rivera bustled in from the kitchen, carrying a steaming platter of beef and vegetables. "Dinner is ready. Senor Caleb, please sit." "You too, Miss Fiona. The men have already eaten in the bunkhouse, so it's just the three of us tonight. Miguel is checking on a sick calf." Throughout the meal, Fiona found her thoughts returning to Caleb's words. Could there be more to the fire than she knew? It had started in the back storeroom while she was preparing for bed. By the time she smelled the smoke, the flames had already spread too far to contain. She'd barely escaped with her life, grabbing only her mother's locket before fleeing into the street. After dinner, Caleb excused himself to his study, leaving Fiona to help Mrs. Rivera with the dishes. When they finished, the housekeeper retired to her small cabin near the main house where she lived with Miguel, leaving Fiona alone in the quiet house. Unable to sleep, she wandered onto the front porch, drawn by the silver light of the full moon. The night was clear, the sky a tapestry of stars more brilliant than she'd ever seen in town. The air carried the scent of pine and sage, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "Couldn't sleep." Caleb's voice came from the shadows at the far end of the porch, startling her. "You frightened me," she said, pressing a hand to her heart. "I didn't see you there." He stepped into the moonlight, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. "My apologies, I often come out here at night, helps me think." "I'll leave you to your solitude then," Fiona said, turning to go back inside. "Stay," he said quickly, then more softly, "if you'd like." She hesitated, then moved to join him at the porch railing. For several minutes they stood in comfortable silence, gazing out at the moonlit landscape. "I've been trying to piece it together," Caleb said eventually. "Why a town would turn against one of its own so completely," Fiona sighed. "I've wondered the same. I grew up in Jerome, everyone knew my family, we were respected members of the community." She traced a pattern on the wooden railing with her fingertip. But there had been tensions recently. Caleb turned to look at her, his expression questioning. "My father refused to sell the store," she explained. "There's been talk of silver in the mountains nearby. Investors from back east have been buying up properties, hoping to cash in if a major strike is made." "And your father wouldn't sell," she shook her head. "The store was his life's work. He built it from nothing when Jerome was just a handful of buildings. He said no amount of money could replace what it meant to him." A sad smile touched her lips. "He's stubborn that way." "Like his daughter," Caleb observed, a hint of warmth in his voice. Fiona glanced up at him, surprised by the comment, but his expression had already returned to thoughtful contemplation. "Who wanted to buy the store?" he asked. "A man named Elliot Hargrove. Represents some mining investors from Philadelphia. He's been in town for months, buying everything he can." She frowned, recalling the man's cold gray eyes and false smile. "He wasn't happy with my father's refusal." Caleb took a sip of his drink. "Unhappy enough to burn down a store." Fiona gasped. "You think Mr. Hargrove could have?" She couldn't complete the thought, the implication too terrible to voice. "I don't know," Caleb said carefully, "but it's worth considering. If the town's already in his pocket, it would explain why no one came to your aid." The possibility settled cold and heavy in Fiona's stomach. She'd been so focused on surviving, she hadn't considered that the fire might have been deliberately set. "What would I do?" she whispered. "Even if it were true, I have no proof." Caleb set his glass down on the railing and turned to face her fully. In the moonlight, his features were cast in silver and shadow, lending him an almost mythic quality. "First, we wait for news of your parents," he said firmly. "Then, if you wish, I'll help you find the truth." "Why?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Why would you do all this for me? You barely know me." For a long moment he was silent, his gaze searching her face as if the answer might be found there. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, "and because—" He hesitated, then seemed to think better of what he was about to say. "Because no one else is doing it." Fiona sensed there was more he wasn't saying, but she didn't press. Instead, she simply nodded. "Thank you, Caleb." The use of his given name seemed to shift something between them, a small but significant change in the atmosphere. His eyes softened as they held hers, and for a breathless moment, Fiona wondered if he might move closer. Instead, he picked up his glass and stepped back. "It's late. You should get some rest." "Yes," she agreed, suddenly aware of how improper it was for them to be alone together in the moonlight. "Good night, Caleb. Good night, Fiona." As she made her way back to her room, Fiona found her thoughts in turmoil. The possibility that the fire had been deliberate, set by someone who wanted her family's property, filled her with both fear and anger. But beneath those emotions lay a growing awareness of Caleb Zimmerman, his kindness, his strength, and the inexplicable connection she felt forming between them. Sleep was long in coming that night. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with a hint of autumn in the air despite the lingering summer heat. Fiona rose early, dressed in one of the borrowed dresses, a simple blue cotton that Mrs. Rivera had altered to fit her slender frame, and went downstairs to help with breakfast. She found Mrs. Rivera already at work in the kitchen, kneading dough for biscuits. "Good morning," Fiona greeted her, tying an apron around her waist. "What can I do to help?" "You can scramble those eggs, Mrs. Rivera replied with a smile. "The men will be hungry after tending to the morning chores." As Fiona worked, she glanced occasionally out the window, watching the activity in the ranch yard. Miguel was directing two younger men in repairing a section of fence, while another ranch hand led a string of horses to the corral for training. There was no sign of Caleb. "He rode out at dawn," Mrs. Rivera said, noticing her searching gaze. "Said he had business to attend to." Fiona felt her cheeks warm at being so transparent. "I was just curious about the day's schedule," she lied, cracking another egg into the bowl. Mrs. Rivera made a sound that might have been skepticism or amusement. "Senor Caleb is a complicated man, very private about his past, but a good man." "Has he owned this ranch long?" Fiona asked, seizing the opportunity to learn more about her enigmatic host. 5 years. Came here from Texas with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and a haunted look in his eyes. Mrs. Rivera shaped the biscuit dough with practiced hands. "Never speaks of what happened before, but I think there was great sadness." "He's not married," Fiona observed, trying to sound casual as she stirred the eggs. Mrs. Rivera's knowing smile made it clear she saw through the pretense. "No. There have been ladies who tried to catch his eye, daughters of ranchers, widows looking for security, but he shows no interest." She placed the biscuits on a tray and slid them into the oven. "Until now, perhaps, Mrs. Rivera," Fiona protested, her face flaming. "That's not I'm not," the housekeeper laughed, a warm, rich sound. "Of course, child, of course." Before Fiona could formulate a response, the sound of hoofbeats outside drew their attention. Mrs. Rivera moved to the window. "It's Daniel, returning from Prescott." Fiona's heart leapt. News of her parents? She hurriedly wiped her hands on her apron and rushed outside, Mrs. Rivera close behind. The ranch hand, a weathered man in his 40s, dismounted from his horse as Fiona approached. "Miss Davenport," he greeted her, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "Did you find my parents?" she asked anxiously. "Are they well?" Daniel nodded. They're fine, madam, worried sick about you, of course. They heard about the fire 2 days after it happened and were preparing to return immediately when I found them. Relief washed over Fiona like a cool wave. When will they arrive? That's the thing, madam. Your father broke his leg about a week ago, fell from a horse while visiting some property with your uncle. He can't travel yet, doctor's orders. Your mother won't leave him, but she sent this letter for you. He reached into his saddlebag and extracted an envelope. Fiona took it with trembling hands. Thank you, Daniel. There's more, he said, his expression turning grave. The boss asked me to look into the fire. I talked to some folks in town, careful-like, not letting on why I was asking. What did you learn? She asked, clutching the letter tightly. Daniel glanced around, then lowered his voice. There's talk that it wasn't no accident. Old Tom Jenkins, he runs the livery stable, said he saw someone hanging around the back of your store late that night. Didn't think much of it at the time. Did he recognize who it was? No, madam, but he did say the man was well-dressed, not like the usual folk in Jerome. Fiona thought of Elliot Hargrove with his expensive Eastern suits and polished boots. Could it have been him? Or someone working for him? Thank you for telling me, she said, her mind racing with implications. Did you mention any of this to Caleb, Mr. Zimmerman? Not yet, madam. He wasn't here when I rode in, and the boss said to report to you directly if he wasn't around. Mrs. Rivera, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. Come inside, Daniel. You must be hungry after your journey. We have breakfast nearly ready. As the ranch hand followed Mrs. Rivera into the house, Fiona remained on the porch, opening her mother's letter with unsteady fingers. The familiar handwriting brought tears to her eyes. My dearest Fiona, the letter began. Words cannot express the anguish we felt upon hearing of the fire. To think of you alone and in danger breaks my heart. Your father is beside himself with worry, though the doctor forbids him to travel with his leg in such condition. We are immensely relieved to learn you are safe at the Zimmerman Ranch. Though we know Mr. Zimmerman only slightly through business dealings, your father speaks highly of his character and integrity. There are matters concerning the fire that trouble us deeply. Your father had received threats regarding his refusal to sell the store, though he kept this from you to spare you worry. We fear the fire may not have been accidental. Please remain where you are until we can come for you. We expect to travel within 2 weeks once your father's condition improves. Know that we love you beyond measure and thank God you were spared. With all my love, Mother. Fiona lowered the letter, her suspicions confirmed. Her father had received threats, and now their home and livelihood lay in ashes. Anger welled up inside her, replacing the fear and uncertainty that had plagued her since the night of the fire. She was still standing on the porch, letter in hand, when Caleb rode into the yard shortly after midday. His expression was grim as he dismounted and strode toward her. You've heard from your parents, he asked without preamble. Fiona nodded, holding up the letter. Daniel delivered it this morning. My father broke his leg and cannot travel yet, but they're both well. Relief softened Caleb's features momentarily, but the serious set of his jaw remained. I've been to Jerome, he said. Wanted to see things for myself. What did you find? She asked, stepping closer. Enough to make me believe your suspicions about Hargrove might be correct. He gestured toward the house. Let's talk inside. In the privacy of Caleb's study, a comfortable room lined with bookshelves and featuring a large desk of polished oak, he revealed what he had learned. Hargrove has purchased 7 properties in town over the past 6 months, he explained, pacing before the unlit fireplace. The general store was the only building on that block he didn't own, with it gone. He can buy the land at a fraction of its worth, Fiona finished, sinking into a leather chair as the full implications became clear. Exactly. Caleb stopped pacing and faced her. I also spoke with the blacksmith, a man named Cooper who seems to be one of the few not in Hargrove's pocket. He told me Hargrove's been boasting that soon he'll own the entire east side of town. That doesn't prove he set the fire, Fiona pointed out, though in her heart she was already convinced. No, it doesn't. Caleb leaned against his desk, arms crossed over his chest. But I also talked to a boy who works at the hotel. Said he saw Hargrove meet with two strangers the night before the fire, rough-looking men who left town the morning after. Fiona felt cold despite the warm day. Hired men to do his dirty work. Caleb nodded grimly. That would be my guess. What can we do? She asked, her voice small but determined. Without proof, it's just speculation. For a long moment, Caleb was silent, his gaze fixed on something beyond the window. When he spoke again, his voice was low and resolute. We find proof. And then we make Hargrove pay for what he's done. The intensity in his blue eyes sent a shiver down Fiona's spine, not of fear, but of something more complex. In that moment, she saw beyond the reserved rancher to the man beneath, passionate, principled, and willing to fight for justice. I'll help in any way I can, she said firmly. Caleb's expression softened as he looked at her. I know you will. You're stronger than you realize, Fiona Davenport. His words warmed her from within, chasing away some of the cold dread that had settled in her chest. For the first time since the fire, she felt a spark of hope that justice might be possible. As days stretched into weeks, life at the Double Z settled into a routine that brought Fiona unexpected comfort. Each morning, she rose with the dawn to help Mrs. Rivera prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. Afterward, she threw herself into whatever tasks needed doing, mending clothes, preserving vegetables from the kitchen garden, or helping with the endless cleaning that a working ranch required. The physical labor was a blessing, keeping her hands busy and her mind from dwelling too much on all she had lost. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, she often found herself on the porch with Caleb, sharing the quiet as darkness settled over the land. They rarely spoke of Jerome or Hargrove during these twilight meetings. Instead, Caleb told her about his cattle, his plans for expanding the ranch, or stories of the land and its history. In turn, Fiona shared memories of her childhood, her dreams of someday traveling east to see the cities she'd only read about in books, and her love of literature. My mother taught me to read before I was 5, she confided one evening as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Books were my escape, my window to worlds beyond Jerome. What's your favorite? Caleb asked, genuinely interested. Fiona considered the question. I love Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, the way she captures human nature with all its flaws and virtues. She trailed off, suddenly self-conscious. You must think me frivolous, caring about fictional characters when there are real concerns at hand. Not at all, he replied, his voice gentle. We need stories to make sense of our own lives, to remind us of what's possible. She glanced at him, surprised by his thoughtfulness. Do you read much? A shadow of a smile crossed his face. More than most cowboys, I suppose. My mother was a schoolteacher. She believed education was as necessary as bread. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, he said simply, and Fiona heard the past tense with a pang of sympathy. I'm sorry, she murmured. Caleb nodded, acknowledging her condolence without elaborating. After a moment, he changed the subject. I received word today that your father's health is improving. They hope to travel within the week. Fiona's heart leapt with joy at the news, but there was also a strange reluctance mingled with her happiness. The realization that she would soon leave the Double Z leave Caleb brought an unexpected ache. That's wonderful, she said, forcing brightness into her tone. I've missed them terribly. Of course, Caleb agreed, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. They'll stay here when they arrive. The journey will be taxing for your father, and he'll need time to recover before deciding on next steps. You're very generous, Fiona said softly. I don't know how we'll ever repay you. There's nothing to repay, he replied firmly. Anyone would have done the same. But they hadn't, Fiona thought. No one in Jerome had offered her shelter or comfort. Only this man, this quiet rancher who kept his own counsel and asked for nothing in return. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the moment. Both turned to see a rider coming hard up the drive, his horse lathered despite the cool evening air. Caleb straightened, instantly alert. "That's Jim Watson from the Circle W," he said, recognizing the rider. "Something's wrong." He moved quickly down the porch steps to meet the rider as he reined in his exhausted horse. "Zimmerman," Watson called, his voice urgent. "Trouble in town, thought you should know." "What kind of trouble?" Caleb demanded. Watson dismounted, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. "It's Hargrove. He's filed a claim on the Davenport property, saying they abandoned it after the fire." Fiona gasped, moving to stand beside Caleb. "He can't do that. My parents still own that land." Watson's expression was grim as he acknowledged her presence with a respectful nod. "Madam, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. Hargrove's got the town council in his pocket. They voted this afternoon to approve his claim, citing some ordinance about abandoned properties posing public safety hazards." "That's outrageous," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The Davenports haven't even had time to return and address the situation." "It gets worse," Watson continued. "Hargrove's men are clearing the site tomorrow. By the time your folks get back, there won't be anything left to claim." Fiona felt as though the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. Not only had they lost their home and business to fire, but now Hargrove was legally stealing their land as well. It was too much to bear. "We have to stop him," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "He can't get away with this." Caleb turned to her, his expression grave but determined. "We will," he promised, then addressed Watson again. "Jim, thank you for bringing this news. Will you stay the night? Your horse needs rest." "Much obliged," Watson replied. "I figured you'd want to know, considering." He glanced between Caleb and Fiona with a knowing look that suggested rumors had already begun to circulate about Fiona's presence at the Double Z. "Miguel will show you to the bunkhouse," Caleb said, dismissing any implied impropriety with the authority of his tone. "There's food in the kitchen if you're hungry." As Watson led his horse toward the barn, Caleb turned to Fiona, his expression resolute. "First thing tomorrow, we ride to Jerome. I know a judge in Prescott who can issue an injunction against Hargrove's claim, but we need to delay the clearing of the site until it can be obtained." "How?" Fiona asked, struggling to maintain her composure in the face of this new threat. Caleb's jaw set in a determined line. "Leave that to me. Pack whatever you'll need for a day or two in town. We leave at first light." That night, sleep eluded Fiona entirely. She packed her few belongings, the mended dress she had been wearing when Caleb found her, and two simple dresses Mrs. Rivera had altered from those left by Caleb's sister. Her mother's silver locket remained around her neck, a tangible link to her family and their heritage. As promised, they set out at dawn, Fiona riding a gentle mare from Caleb's stable while he mounted his chestnut stallion. The journey to Jerome was made mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. The town looked different to Fiona as they approached, smaller somehow, and less welcoming than the home she remembered. Or perhaps it was she who had changed in the weeks since the fire. People stopped to stare as they rode down the main street, Caleb tall and imposing beside her. Whispers followed in their wake, but Fiona held her head high, refusing to be shamed by the town that had abandoned her in her hour of need. They reined in their horses before the charred remains of the general store. Already, a crew of men was at work, clearing debris and salvaging usable materials. Overseeing them was a tall, slender man in an expensive suit, Elliot Hargrove. He turned as they approached, his thin lips curving into a smile that didn't reach his cold gray eyes. "Well, well, Miss Davenport returns and with company." His gaze flicked to Caleb, assessing and dismissive. "Mr. Zimmerman, isn't it? The cattle rancher." "That's right," Caleb replied evenly, dismounting and helping Fiona down from her horse. "And you're trespassing on Davenport property, Hargrove." Hargrove's smile tightened. "I think you'll find that's no longer the case. The town council has approved my claim to this lot, given the owner's abandonment following the unfortunate fire." I didn't abandon anything, Fiona said, stepping forward, anger overcoming her usual reserve. I was driven away by cruel indifference after someone deliberately set fire to my family's store. A murmur ran through the small crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation. Hargrove's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a cold stare. That's a serious accusation, Miss Davenport. I'd be careful about making unfounded claims. There's nothing unfounded about it, Caleb interjected, his voice carrying to the onlookers. We have witnesses who saw suspicious individuals meeting with you the night before the fire. Strangers who left town immediately after the Davenport store burned to the ground. Hargrove's face flushed with anger, but he maintained his composure. Circumstantial at best, and irrelevant to the current situation, this property has been legally transferred to me by town ordinance. An ordinance manipulated by bribery and coercion, Caleb countered. Judge Patterson in Prescott will have something to say about that. At the mention of the judge's name, uncertainty flickered across Hargrove's face. Judge Patterson was known throughout the territory for his unwavering commitment to justice and his immunity to bribes or influence. Until he does, Hargrove recovered smoothly, the work continues. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to. He turned his back on them, a deliberate insult, and began giving instructions to the workmen. But as Fiona watched, the men exchanged glances and slowly lowered their tools. One of them, a burly man with a weathered face, stepped forward. Begging your pardon, Mr. Hargrove, but if there's a question about who owns this land, I reckon we ought to wait before clearing it. You're paid to work, Matthews, not to think, Hargrove snapped. Get back to it or find yourself another job. Matthews looked at his fellow workers, then back at Hargrove. Reckon I'll find another job then. Davenports have been good folks in this town for years. Don't sit right, taking their land while they're away. One by one, the other workers nodded in agreement, setting down their tools and stepping away from the site. Hargrove's face contorted with rage as he realized he was losing control of the situation. You'll regret this, he hissed at Caleb. All of you will regret crossing me. The only one with regrets will be you, Hargrove, Caleb replied steadily, when the truth about the fire comes to light. Hargrove's hand moved toward his jacket, and for a tense moment, Fiona feared he was reaching for a weapon. Instead, he straightened his lapels with forced composure. We'll see about that, rancher, we'll see. With that, he stalked away, pushing through the crowd that had grown considerably during the confrontation. As he disappeared down the street, the tension in the air gradually dissipated. Matthews approached Fiona, hat in hand. Miss Davenport, I want to apologize. We didn't know. That is, we were told you'd left town for good. Thank you for standing up for my family, Fiona replied, genuinely moved by the man's belated show of solidarity. As other townspeople began to approach, some offering apologies and others simply curious, Caleb placed a protective hand at the small of Fiona's back. We should find somewhere to stay, he said quietly. It's going to be a long couple of days. They secured rooms at the Jerome Hotel, separate rooms, with Caleb insisting on propriety despite the additional expense. As they parted in the hallway, Caleb's hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary. Get some rest, he advised. Tomorrow we begin gathering evidence against Hargrove. There must be someone in town who saw something the night of the fire. Fiona nodded, suddenly exhausted by the day's events. Thank you, Caleb, for everything. His blue eyes softened as they held hers. You're not alone in this, Fiona, remember that. As she closed her door, Fiona leaned against it, her heart beating an irregular rhythm that had nothing to do with fear or anger, and everything to do with the man who had become her unexpected champion. The next day dawned bright and clear, but Fiona awoke with a sense of foreboding that even the cheerful sunlight couldn't dispel. After a simple breakfast in the hotel dining room, she and Caleb set out to speak with potential witnesses. Their first stop was the livery stable, where old Tom Jenkins confirmed what Daniel had reported. He had indeed seen a well-dressed man lurking behind the general store the night of the fire. Though he couldn't positively identify Hargrove, he admitted the figure had been of similar build and bearing. "Never thought much about it until after," Tom confessed, leaning on a pitchfork as he spoke. "Figured it might have been someone stepping out for a smoke. But then when I heard how quick that fire took hold." He shook his head grimly. Next, they visited the hotel where Hargrove was staying. The boy who worked there, a freckle-faced lad of about 14, nervously confirmed that he had seen Hargrove meeting with two rough-looking strangers the evening before the fire. "They was in Mr. Hargrove's private dining room," the boy whispered, constantly glancing over his shoulder to ensure they weren't overheard. "I was serving them drinks, and Mr. Hargrove told me to wait outside, but I heard him mention the store and something about making it look natural." "Would you be willing to testify to that before a judge?" Caleb asked. Fear flashed across the boy's face. I don't know, sir. Mr. Hargrove, he's a powerful man. My ma needs this job." Fiona touched the boy's arm gently. "I understand your fear. But my family has lost everything because of what Hargrove did. Without witnesses like you, he'll never face justice." The boy hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I'll do it. If the judge asks me, I'll tell what I heard." By mid-afternoon, they had spoken with half a dozen people who could provide pieces of the puzzle none conclusive on their own, but together forming a damning pattern of evidence against Hargrove. They were heading back to the hotel when a commotion in the street drew their attention. A stagecoach had arrived, and among the passengers disembarking were two familiar figures, Fiona's parents. "Mother, father!" Fiona cried, rushing forward. Her mother turned at the sound of her voice, face lighting up with relief and joy. "Fiona, oh thank God!" They embraced tearfully while her father, leaning heavily on a cane, waited his turn to hold his daughter. He looked older than Fiona remembered, his face lined with pain and worry, but his eyes were bright with love. "My brave girl," he murmured as he finally held her close. "When we heard about the fire—" "I'm fine, father," Fiona assured him, though her voice broke on the words. "Thanks to Mr. Zimmerman." She turned to introduce Caleb, who had respectfully kept his distance during the family reunion. "Mother, father, this is Caleb Zimmerman. He took me in when I had nowhere to go." Caleb stepped forward, removing his hat. "Mr. and Mrs. Davenport, I'm relieved to see you both well." George Davenport extended his hand, emotion making his voice rough. "Mr. Zimmerman, I don't know how to thank you for helping our daughter when we couldn't be there for her." "No thanks necessary, sir," Caleb replied, shaking the older man's hand firmly. "Your daughter has been a welcome guest at my ranch." Margaret Davenport, a dignified woman whose features Fiona had inherited, studied Caleb with keen eyes. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, for she nodded slightly before addressing him. "We received your message in Prescott about Hargrove's attempt to claim our property. We came as quickly as my husband's condition allowed." "You've arrived at a critical time," Caleb explained. "We've spent the day gathering evidence against Hargrove, both regarding the fire and his underhanded tactics with the town council." "Then let's not waste another moment," George declared, his jaw set with determination despite his obvious discomfort. "Where can we speak privately?" They retired to the hotel's small dining room, which was empty in the lull between lunch and dinner service. Over cups of strong coffee, Caleb and Fiona shared everything they had learned about Hargrove's schemes. George listened intently, his expression darkening with each revelation. "I knew Hargrove was determined to buy our property, but I never imagined he'd resort to arson," he said when they had finished. "The man approached me multiple times, each offer higher than the last. When I continued to refuse, he became unpleasant." "How so?" Caleb asked, leaning forward. "Veiled threats, mostly. Said accidents happen to those who stand in the way of progress." George's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "I didn't take him seriously enough, it seems." "What do we do now?" Margaret asked, placing a supportive hand on her husband's arm. Caleb glanced toward the window, where the afternoon sun was beginning to lower in the sky. Judge Patterson is due to arrive in Jerome tomorrow morning. I sent a telegram from the ranch before we left, explaining the situation. He'll hear our evidence and rule on Hargrove's claim to your property." "And if he rules in our favor?" Fiona asked. "Then we'll press charges against Hargrove for arson and fraud," Caleb replied. "With the witnesses we've gathered, there's a good chance he'll face prison." George nodded grimly. "Justice is what matters most." "Even if we can't rebuild the store," his voice faltered slightly, "at least the man responsible will pay for what he's done." As they continued discussing strategy for the next day's hearing, none of them noticed the hotel employee who had been lingering near the door, listening to their conversation with growing alarm, before slipping away to report what he had heard. That evening, after seeing her parents settled in their hotel room, George exhausted from the journey, and in need of rest, Fiona found herself once again on the hotel's small balcony with Caleb. The stars were emerging in the darkening sky, but the peace they usually brought her was absent, replaced by nervous anticipation of the confrontation to come. "Are you afraid?" Caleb asked quietly, standing beside her at the railing. Fiona considered the question. "Yes," she admitted. "Not of Hargrove himself, but of failing, of not getting justice for my family after everything they've lost. We have strong evidence," Caleb reminded her, "and Judge Patterson is a fair man. He'll see the truth." "I hope so." She turned to face him, the fading light casting shadows across his strong features. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know how grateful I am, not just for the shelter you provided, but for believing in me when no one else would." Caleb's gaze softened as it held hers. "You make it easy to believe in you, Fiona Davenport." Something in his voice, a warmth, a tenderness she hadn't heard before, made her heart skip a beat. They stood close, the evening breeze carrying the scent of pine and sage between them. For a breathless moment, Fiona thought he might close the distance between them, might gather her into his arms as she had imagined more than once during her nights at the Double Z. Instead, he took a small step back, his expression regaining its usual reserve. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow will test us all." Disappointment fluttered in her chest, but Fiona nodded agreement. "Good night, Caleb. Good night, Fiona." As she turned to go, his voice stopped her. "Fiona," she looked back, hope rising unbidden. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said softly, "know that you'll always have a home at the Double Z if you want it." The simple offer, spoken with such quiet sincerity, meant more to her than grand declarations might have. It spoke of a future, of possibilities beyond the immediate crisis. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting herself to say more, and retreated to her room with her thoughts in turmoil. The next morning, Fiona awoke to the sound of raised voices in the street below her window. Dressing quickly, she hurried downstairs to find Caleb in the hotel lobby, his expression grim. "What's happening?" she asked, alarmed by the tension evident in his posture. "Hargrove's been busy," he replied tersely. "He's gathered a crowd of supporters outside the town hall, claiming we're trying to swindle him out of property he legally acquired." "But that's ridiculous," Fiona protested. "He's the one who's—" "I know," Caleb interrupted gently. "But he's managed to convince some of the townspeople that we're the villains in this scenario. It's a tactic to pressure Judge Patterson, who should be arriving on the morning stage." George and Margaret joined them, her father moving slowly but with determination. "Let's not keep the judge waiting," George said firmly. "The sooner this matter is resolved, the better." Together, they made their way through the crowded streets to the town hall, where Judge Patterson had agreed to hold an emergency hearing. As Caleb had warned, a group of men had gathered outside, their faces hostile as they watched the Davenports approach. "There they are," one called out. "Come to block progress in our town." "Hargrove's bringing jobs and prosperity," shouted another. "What did your store ever do but take our money?" Fiona flinched at the cruel words, but Caleb's steady presence beside her gave her courage to keep walking, head held high. As they neared the town hall steps, the crowd parted grudgingly, revealing Elliot Hargrove waiting at the entrance, a smug smile on his thin face. "Ah, the Davenport family reunited at last," he said with false cordiality. "And Mr. Zimmerman, of course, always ready to meddle in affairs that don't concern him." "Justice concerns everyone, Hargrove," Caleb replied evenly. "Step aside. We have an appointment with the judge." Hargrove's smile hardened, but he moved away from the door with an exaggerated bow. "By all means. I'm looking forward to putting this matter to rest once and for all." Inside the town hall, Judge Patterson, a stern-faced man with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes, was already seated at a table at the front of the room. He acknowledged their entrance with a brief nod, then rapped his gavel to bring the murmuring crowd to order. "This is not a formal trial," he announced, his voice carrying authority without the need for volume. "It is a hearing to determine the rightful ownership of the property formerly occupied by Davenport's General Store and to consider related allegations of criminal activity. I will hear from all parties and render a decision based on the evidence presented. Is that understood?" Nods of agreement came from both sides of the dispute. "Very well. Mr. Hargrove, as the current claimant to the property, you may speak first." Hargrove stepped forward, adjusting his expensive jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor. The facts in this case are quite straightforward. Following the unfortunate fire that destroyed the Davenport store, the property was abandoned. No efforts were made to clear the debris or rebuild, creating a safety hazard in the heart of our growing town." He paced slowly as he spoke, his voice smooth and persuasive. "The town council, acting within its authority under Ordinance 17, transferred ownership to me after the prescribed waiting period. I have plans to construct a modern mercantile on the site, providing jobs and services to the community." "And the accusations of arson?" Judge Patterson asked bluntly. Hargrove spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. "Baseless slander, Your Honor. The fire was clearly the result of negligence, a lamp left burning by Miss Davenport, who was alone in the store that night. The timing was unfortunate for the Davenports, certainly, but to suggest criminal intent is absurd and defamatory." Judge Patterson's expression revealed nothing as he made notes. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove. Mr. Davenport, you may now present your case." George stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane. "Your Honor, my family has owned that property for 15 years. We built a business that served this community faithfully. When the fire occurred, my wife and I were in Prescott, where I was recovering from a broken leg that prevented immediate travel." He gestured toward Fiona. "My daughter did not abandon the property willingly. She was left homeless and received no assistance from the town she had lived in all her life. If not for the kindness of Mr. Zimmerman, she might have perished from exposure or hunger." Murmurs rippled through the crowd at this accusation, and several townspeople looked away, shame evident in their expressions. "As for Ordinance 17, George continued, it requires a waiting period of 30 days before abandoned property can be claimed. The fire occurred just 24 days ago, making the council's decision premature and invalid." Judge Patterson raised an eyebrow. "Is this true?" The mayor, a portly man seated near the front, shifted uncomfortably. "There may have been some flexibility in the interpretation of the waiting period." "I see," the judge said dryly. "And the accusation of arson, Mr. Davenport. Do you have evidence to support this serious claim?" "We do, Your Honor," Caleb interjected, stepping forward. "With your permission, we'd like to present several witnesses who can testify to suspicious activities surrounding the fire." Judge Patterson nodded. "Proceed." Over the next hour, Caleb and the Davenports presented their case methodically. Tom Jenkins described the figure he'd seen behind the store. The hotel boy, nervous but determined, recounted the conversation he'd overheard between Hargrove and the mysterious strangers. A member of the town council reluctantly admitted that Hargrove had pressured them to approve his claim quickly, offering incentives for their cooperation. Throughout the testimony, Hargrove's expression darkened, his initial confidence giving way to barely contained fury. When it was his turn to cross-examine the witnesses, his questions were sharp, designed to intimidate rather than clarify. "You expect us to believe that a boy who washes dishes heard a private conversation through a closed door?" he demanded of the hotel boy. "The door wasn't fully closed, sir," the boy replied, standing his ground despite his evident fear. "And you was talking real loud, especially when you said the Davenports would learn not to refuse your offers." A gasp went through the crowd at this revelation. Judge Patterson's eyes narrowed as he studied Hargrove's reaction. "That's a lie," Hargrove snapped. "This entire proceeding is a farce designed to deprive me of property I legally acquired." "Control yourself, Mr. Hargrove," Judge Patterson warned. "Outbursts will not serve your case." As the hearing continued, the weight of evidence against Hargrove mounted. A telegram from the sheriff in Tucson confirmed that the two men seen meeting with Hargrove had been involved in suspicious fires in other territories, though never formally charged. Finally, Judge Patterson called for concluding statements. George Davenport spoke briefly, his voice steady despite his evident fatigue. "We ask only for justice, Your Honor. For the opportunity to rebuild what was taken from us through criminal means, and for the man responsible to face the consequences of his actions." Hargrove, when his turn came, had regained his composure but could not mask the coldness in his eyes. "These accusations are nothing but a desperate attempt to explain away Miss Davenport's negligence. The town council made its decision based on what's best for Jerome's future. I urge you to uphold that decision and allow progress to continue." Judge Patterson considered silently for several minutes, reviewing his notes while the room waited in tense anticipation. At last he looked up, his expression grave. "Having heard the evidence presented, I find the town council's decision to transfer ownership of the Davenport property to Mr. Hargrove to be invalid on multiple grounds. First, the waiting period specified in Ordinance 17 had not elapsed. Second, there is compelling evidence that the council was improperly influenced in its decision-making process." Relief washed over Fiona, and she reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the evidence strongly suggests that the fire which destroyed the Davenport store was not accidental, but rather the result of deliberate arson, likely committed at Mr. Hargrove's behest." Hargrove surged to his feet. "This is outrageous." "You have no proof. Silence," Judge Patterson commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "One more outburst and I'll have you removed from this proceeding." He waited until Hargrove reluctantly resumed his seat before continuing. "I am ordering the immediate return of the property to the Davenport family. Additionally, I am instructing Sheriff Davis to place Mr. Hargrove under arrest pending a formal investigation into charges of arson, fraud, and attempted theft." The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and protests as Sheriff Davis, who had been standing quietly at the back of the room, moved forward to take Hargrove into custody. "You'll regret this," Hargrove hissed as he was led past the Davenport family. "All of you." "The only regrets are yours, Hargrove," Caleb replied steadily. "Justice has been served." As Hargrove was escorted from the town hall, the atmosphere in the room gradually shifted. Townspeople who had kept their distance from the Davenports now approached, offering belated apologies and promises of help with rebuilding. Judge Patterson made his way through the crowd to where Fiona stood with her parents and Caleb. "Mr. Davenport, Mrs. Davenport," he greeted them formally. "I regret the circumstances that brought us together, but I'm satisfied that justice has been done today." "Thanks to you, Your Honor," George replied, shaking the judge's hand gratefully. "And to Mr. Zimmerman, who stood by my daughter when others would not." The judge turned his penetrating gaze to Caleb. "Zimmerman, I've heard good things about your ranch. Seems you're as skilled at uncovering the truth as you are at raising cattle." Caleb accepted the compliment with a modest nod. "Just doing what needed to be done, Your Honor." As the judge moved away to speak with the sheriff, Fiona found herself overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of their fortunes. The property was restored to her family, Hargrove would face punishment for his crimes, and the town that had shunned her was now offering support. Yet amidst the relief and vindication, a new uncertainty troubled her heart. With justice secured and her parents returned, there was no longer any reason for her to stay at the Double Z. The thought of leaving Caleb, of returning to a life that no longer included his quiet strength and unwavering support, filled her with an unexpected sense of loss. The celebration continued into the evening, with townspeople gathering at the hotel to toast the Davenports' victory and discuss plans for helping rebuild the store. Fiona participated in the conversations, accepting apologies and well wishes with grace, but her gaze repeatedly sought out Caleb, who had positioned himself at the edge of the gathering, nursing a single glass of whiskey as he observed the proceedings. When she finally managed to break away from the crowd, she found him on the hotel's balcony, staring out at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "There you are," she said softly, joining him at the railing. "I was afraid you might have left without saying goodbye." Caleb turned to her, his expression unreadable in the twilight. "I wouldn't do that," he replied simply. For a moment they stood in silence, the sounds of celebration drifting up from below, a stark contrast to the quiet intensity building between them. "What happens now?" Fiona finally asked, the question encompassing far more than she dared to articulate. Caleb seemed to understand the unspoken dimensions of her query. "Your father mentioned plans to rebuild the store. It will take time, but with the town's support, it's possible." "Yes," she acknowledged. "He's already talking about improvements, ways to make it better than before." She hesitated, then added softly, "But I wasn't asking about the store." Caleb's gaze met hers, and in his blue eyes she saw the same uncertainty that plagued her heart. "What do you want to happen, Fiona?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. In the weeks they had known each other, Caleb had never pressed her for her feelings, never presumed to know her mind. Even now, when something profound had clearly grown between them, he was giving her the space to define its parameters. "I don't want to say goodbye," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "These past weeks, despite everything, the fire, Hargrove's schemes, the uncertainty, they've also been special to me because of you." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Caleb's expression softened, a warmth entering his eyes that she had glimpsed only rarely. "They've been special to me too," he confessed. "Having you at the Double Z, it changed things, made the place feel more like a home than it ever has." Hope blossomed in Fiona's chest, but she tempered it with practical considerations. "My parents need me, especially now, the rebuilding, getting the business started again." "I understand," Caleb said, his voice gentle but tinged with resignation. "Family comes first, it always should." "But that doesn't mean," Fiona began, then paused, gathering her courage. "That doesn't mean there couldn't be a future for us if you wanted it." The words were bold, more forward than propriety typically allowed a young woman, but the extraordinary circumstances of their acquaintance had long since rendered conventional courtship impossible. Caleb stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. "I do want it, Fiona, more than I've wanted anything in a very long time." His hand found hers on the railing, his calloused fingers entwining with her slender ones. The simple touch sent a thrill through her that was both exciting and comforting at once. "I should speak with your father," he said, his tone serious despite the light in his eyes. "Ask his permission to court you properly, once things have settled." Fiona smiled, happiness bubbling up within her like a spring breaking through rock. "He'll say yes," she assured him. "He already thinks of you as a hero." "I'm no hero," Caleb demurred, "just a man who couldn't stand by while injustice was being done." "That's exactly what makes you a hero," she countered softly, emboldened by the tenderness in his gaze to reach up and touch his cheek. "To me, at least." The gesture seemed to break something loose in Caleb, some final reservation he had been holding on to. With gentle deliberation, he cupped her face in his hands, his touch reverent as his gaze searched hers for any sign of hesitation. Finding none, he lowered his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Instead, Fiona rose on her tiptoes to meet him, her eyes fluttering closed as their lips met in a kiss that was both sweeter and more profound than any she had imagined during her nights of solitary contemplation. It was brief propriety demanded as much, even in their private moment, but when they parted, something fundamental had changed between them. A promise had been made, wordless but binding. "I should return to the celebration before my absence is noticed," Fiona said reluctantly, though she made no move to leave his side. "And I should speak with your father," Caleb agreed, equally reluctant to end their moment of connection. They might have remained there longer, suspended in the perfection of newfound understanding, if George Davenport's voice hadn't called up from below. "Fiona, are you up there? Your mother's asking for you." Reality intruded, but gently, a reminder of responsibilities rather than a harsh awakening. "I'm coming, father," she called back, then turned once more to Caleb. "Tomorrow, then," he nodded, his smile carrying all the warmth and promise she could have hoped for. "Tomorrow and all the days after, if you'll have me." "I will," she whispered, sealing the vow with one last brief touch of her hand against his before descending to rejoin her family. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a new beginning in more ways than one. Fiona awoke early, her heart lighter than it had been since before the fire. As she dressed in one of the simple dresses Mrs. Rivera had altered for her, she couldn't help but smile at the thought of returning to the Double Z not as a refugee seeking shelter, but as a welcome guest, perhaps someday even more. She found her parents already at breakfast in the hotel dining room, deep in conversation about plans for rebuilding the store. They looked up as she approached, her mother's keen eyes immediately noting something different in her daughter's demeanor. "You're glowing this morning," Margaret observed as Fiona took a seat beside her. "I haven't seen you look this happy since before everything happened." Fiona felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "I'm just relieved that justice was done," she replied, reaching for the coffee pot. Her father harumphed skeptically. "And I suppose that has nothing to do with a certain cattle rancher who's been watching you like you hung the moon, George," Margaret admonished, though a smile tugged at her lips. "Don't embarrass the girl." "What?" "I'm not blind," George retorted good-naturedly, "and I'm not opposed either. Zimmerman is a good man, solid, the kind who stands by his principles." Fiona's blush deepened. We've spoken about the possibility of courtship," she admitted. "He wants to ask your permission, father." George nodded approvingly. "He'll have it when he asks, but what about the store? We'll need your help to get back on our feet." "I know," Fiona said, her tone serious despite the joy bubbling within her. "And I'll be there every step of the way." "But Jerome is only a few hours' ride from the Double Z. It's not so far that I couldn't split your time between the two," her mother suggested, understanding in her eyes. "That seems a sensible arrangement, at least until we see where this courtship leads." Relief washed over Fiona. She had feared her parents might insist on her full-time presence in Jerome, making a relationship with Caleb difficult to nurture. Their immediate acceptance and practical solution suggested they had perhaps seen the connection between their daughter and the rancher before she had fully acknowledged it herself. "Thank you," she said, reaching out to squeeze her mother's hand gratefully, "for understanding." "We want your happiness, darling," Margaret replied simply. "After everything you've endured, you deserve it." Their conversation was interrupted by Caleb's arrival in the dining room. He approached their table with a respectful nod, hat in hand. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Davenport, Fiona." The way he said her name with a gentle emphasis that conveyed volumes sent a pleasant shiver through Fiona. "Join us, Zimmerman," George invited, gesturing to the empty chair. "We were just discussing future arrangements." As Caleb took the offered seat, his gaze met Fiona's briefly, a silent question in his blue eyes. She smiled reassuringly, letting him know all was well. "I've been thinking," Caleb began, addressing George directly. "The rebuilding of your store will require significant materials: lumber, glass, fixtures. I have connections with suppliers in Prescott who might offer better prices than you'd get locally." "That's very generous," George replied, clearly impressed by the practical offer of assistance. "Not at all." "It's good business," Caleb countered modestly. "And speaking of business, there's another matter I'd like to discuss with you, sir. A more personal one." George's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Would this personal matter concern my daughter by any chance?" Caleb straightened in his chair, his expression serious despite the color that rose to his tanned cheeks. "Yes, sir. I would like your permission to court Fiona with honorable intentions." Though she had been expecting the request, hearing it spoken aloud in her father's presence made Fiona's heart race with a mixture of embarrassment and elation. George considered Caleb thoughtfully, though the outcome was never truly in doubt. "You've proven yourself a man of integrity, Zimmerman. More importantly, you were there for my daughter when she needed someone most." He extended his hand across the table. "You have my permission and my blessing." Caleb shook George's hand firmly, relief and gratitude evident in his expression. "Thank you, sir. I promise to treat her with the respect and care she deserves." "See that you do," George replied, his tone light but carrying a father's warning nonetheless. "Now, tell me more about these suppliers in Prescott. I'm thinking white oak for the new countertops." As the men fell into discussion about building materials, Margaret caught Fiona's eye with a knowing smile. In that silent exchange between mother and daughter, a lifetime of understanding passed between them, acknowledgement of Fiona's transition into a new chapter of her life, approval of the man who would walk beside her through it, and the bittersweet recognition that families evolve and grow in ways both expected and surprising. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. The town of Jerome, perhaps seeking to atone for its earlier abandonment of Fiona, rallied around the Davenport family with offers of assistance for the rebuilding. Plans were drawn up, materials ordered, and work began to clear the site in preparation for construction. Throughout it all, Caleb remained at Fiona's side, offering practical support and quiet encouragement. His presence turned what could have been an overwhelming task into a manageable one, his steady confidence giving her strength when memories of the fire threatened to overshadow her hope for the future. On the 5th day after the hearing, as the foundation for the new store was being laid, Caleb received word that his presence was needed at the Double Z. A problem with one of the wells required his attention, and though he was reluctant to leave, his responsibilities as ranch owner could not be ignored. "I'll return in a few days," he promised Fiona as they stood at the edge of the construction site. "Will you be all right here?" She smiled, touched by his concern but confident in her ability to manage. "I'll be fine. The work is progressing well and my parents need me here for now." She reached for his hand, no longer shy about such gestures of affection. "But I'll miss you." Caleb's fingers tightened around hers. "And you, more than I can say." Their courtship, though only days old in formal terms, had deepened with remarkable speed, built on the foundation of trust and respect established during Fiona's time at the Double Z. There was a certainty between them, an understanding that transcended the usual tentative steps of new romance. "When I return," Caleb said, his voice low and meant for her ears alone, "there's something I'd like to show you at the ranch, a spot I've been thinking about since I realized what you mean to me." The implication in his words that he had been contemplating their future together sent a thrill of anticipation through Fiona. "I look forward to it," she replied, her voice steady despite the fluttering of her heart. Their parting was brief, practical yet tender, a reflection of the relationship that was forming between them, honest, without pretense or unnecessary drama, but deeply felt nonetheless. As promised, Caleb returned to Jerome 5 days later. The store's reconstruction was well underway, with the frame raised and the roof partially completed. Fiona, who had been helping her mother sort through fabric samples for curtains, spotted him riding into town from the upstairs window of the hotel where they were still staying. Without conscious thought, she found herself hurrying downstairs and into the street, propriety forgotten in her eagerness to see him again. Caleb dismounted as she approached, his face lighting up with a smile that transformed his usually serious expression. "You look well," he said by way of greeting, though his eyes conveyed much more than his simple words. "The work has been good for all of us," Fiona replied, matching his restraint though her heart urged more demonstrative greetings. "Having a purpose, something to rebuild rather than just dwelling on what was lost," he nodded, understanding. "The store looks like it's coming along quickly." "Faster than expected. Mr. Cooper, he's the blacksmith, organized a group of men to work extra hours. He said it was the least they could do after." She trailed off, not wanting to revisit the town's earlier failure to support her. "People often rise to their better natures when given the chance," Caleb observed, his tone free of judgment. "It's good that they're making amends." They walked together toward the construction site where George was overseeing the installation of windows. He waved when he spotted them, gesturing for them to join him. "Zimmerman, perfect timing. Those supplies you arranged from Prescott arrived yesterday. Better quality than I expected, and at a fair price too." The men shook hands, and for a time, conversation centered on practical matters of construction and timelines. Eventually, George was called away to consult on another aspect of the building, leaving Caleb and Fiona momentarily alone. "Your father mentioned the store might be operational within a month," Caleb said. "That's remarkable progress." Fiona nodded, gazing at the partially completed structure with pride. "It will be different from the original, larger, with better lighting, but it feels right somehow. A new beginning rather than just replacing what was lost." Caleb's gaze softened as it rested on her profile. "I understand that feeling." She turned to him, sensing deeper meaning in his words. "Do you?" "Yes." He hesitated, then continued with careful deliberation. "I came to Arizona Territory 5 years ago after losing everything in Texas, my family's ranch, my parents, nearly my will to go on. Building the Double Z wasn't just about starting over. It was about creating something new that honored what came before without being defined by its loss." This glimpse into his past, the most he had shared about the events that had shaped him, touched Fiona deeply. She reached for his hand, a gesture of support and understanding. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply, knowing how difficult it was for him to speak of painful memories. He squeezed her hand in acknowledgement, then changed the subject slightly. "The reason I asked about the timeline, I was wondering if you might consider coming back to the Double Z for a visit while the construction is completed. Your parents seem to have matters well in hand, and Mrs. Rivera has been asking after you." The invitation sent a flutter of anticipation through Fiona. Though she had been fully engaged in the rebuilding efforts, she had missed the ranch with an intensity that surprised her, the wide open spaces, the rhythm of ranch life, and most of all, the sense of peace she had found there despite the circumstances that had brought her. "I'd like that very much," she replied honestly. "I should speak with my parents, but I think they would understand." Later that evening, over dinner at the hotel, Fiona broached the subject with her parents. To her surprise, they exchanged a glance that suggested they had already discussed the possibility. "We thought you might want to return to the ranch for a time," her mother said with a gentle smile. "You've been working tirelessly since we began rebuilding, and a change of scenery would do you good. And give you and Zimmerman a chance to further your courtship," her father added pragmatically. "Hard to do that with me hovering about all day, Father." Fiona protested, though she couldn't help smiling at his blunt assessment. "What? It's the truth," George replied unrepentantly. "Young love needs room to grow." Margaret laid a restraining hand on her husband's arm. What your father is trying to say, in his typically unsubtle way, is that we support you spending time at the Double Z. The store will still be here when you return, and we have plenty of help. Gratitude welled up in Fiona's heart for her parents' understanding. Thank you, she said sincerely. I won't be gone long. Take whatever time you need, her mother advised. This courtship is important. It deserves your full attention, at least for a little while. 2 days later, Fiona found herself riding beside Caleb on the familiar trail to the Double Z, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The countryside was beautiful in the late summer sunlight, the scent of sage and pine filling the air as they traveled through stands of ponderosa and across open meadows where wildflowers still bloomed despite the advancing season. I've missed this, she admitted as they crested a rise that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding landscape. The space, the quiet. It grows on you, Caleb agreed, his gaze taking in the vista before them. When I first came here, the emptiness felt like a reflection of what was inside me. Now it feels like possibility. The observation, so personal and yet so aligned with her own experience, reminded Fiona of how much had changed between them since their first meeting. The reserved rancher who had offered blankets to a desperate young woman had gradually revealed himself to be a man of depth and sensitivity. His quiet strength complemented by an innate kindness that drew her to him more powerfully than any grand romantic gesture could have. As they approached the Double Z, Fiona felt a curious sense of homecoming that had little to do with the physical structures ahead, and everything to do with the man riding beside her. This place, which had once been merely a refuge in her darkest hour, had become something more, a symbol of hope, of new beginnings, and of the unexpected ways life could change course when one least expected it. Mrs. Rivera was waiting on the porch as they rode into the yard, her round face alight with pleasure. Miss Fiona, welcome back. The house has not been the same without you. Dismounting, Fiona embraced the housekeeper warmly. I've missed you, Mrs. Rivera, and your cooking, of course. Ah, you flatter an old woman, Mrs. Rivera replied, though her expression made it clear she was pleased by the compliment. Come inside. I have prepared your room and a special dinner to celebrate your return. The evening passed pleasantly, with conversation flowing easily around the dinner table. Miguel joined them, sharing stories of ranch life that had Fiona laughing until tears came to her eyes. The simple camaraderie, the feeling of belonging, reinforced her growing certainty that this place and these people had become essential to her happiness. After dinner, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold, Caleb invited her to join him for a walk. There's something I want to show you, he said, an uncharacteristic nervousness in his tone. If you're not too tired from the journey. Not at all, Fiona assured him, curious about what could inspire such an unusual display of uncertainty in the normally confident rancher. They walked in comfortable silence away from the main house, following a path that wound through a stand of cottonwood trees toward the creek that supplied water to the ranch. The air was cooling as night approached, carrying the scent of water and growing things. The path opened onto a small clearing beside the creek, where a massive oak tree spread its branches protectively over a patch of soft grass. In the last light of day, with the first stars beginning to appear overhead, the spot possessed an almost magical quality. This is my favorite place on the entire ranch, Caleb said softly, stopping beside the oak. I come here sometimes to think, or just to be still for a while. Fiona moved to stand beside him, understanding the significance of his sharing this private sanctuary with her. It's beautiful, she said honestly. Peaceful. Caleb nodded, then turned to face her fully, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. When you were staying here before, after the fire, I found myself coming here more often. Thinking about you, about how you had changed things for me. Her heart quickened at his words, at the depth of feeling evident in his voice. Changed things how? She asked, barely above a whisper, Before you came, the Double Z was just a place I owned, a business I had built." His gaze held her steadily, blue eyes reflecting the deepening twilight. "With you here, it began to feel like a home, and when you left to help your parents rebuild, I realized something I should have known from the moment I found you in the ruins of your store." "What?" Fiona asked, her breath catching in her throat. Caleb reached for her hands, holding them gently in his larger ones. "That I don't want to face the rest of my life without you beside me. That what started as an act of kindness has grown into the most profound love I've ever known." The declaration, spoken with such sincerity in the gathering dusk, brought tears to Fiona's eyes. "Caleb, I know our courtship has been brief by conventional standards," he continued, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke from his heart. "But there's nothing conventional about how we found each other. And I'm certain, more certain than I've been of anything, that what I feel for you is real and lasting." With deliberate grace, he knelt before her on the soft grass, still holding her hands in his. "Fiona Davenport, will you make this ranch a true home, our home, by becoming my wife?" The question, though not entirely unexpected given the direction of their conversation, still took her breath away with its directness and the depth of commitment it represented. Yet there was no hesitation in her heart, no doubt about her answer. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Caleb, I will marry you." Joy transformed his features as he rose to his feet, drawing her into an embrace that spoke of protection, partnership, and passion carefully controlled by respect. When he kissed her, it was with a tenderness that made her previous experiences of romance seem pale and insubstantial by comparison. "I love you," she murmured against his lips when they finally parted. "I think I began to love you that first day when you brought blankets to a stranger who had lost everything." Caleb smiled, the expression lighting his eyes with a warmth that chased away the gathering darkness. "Not everything," he corrected gently. "You never lost your courage or your dignity. They were the first things I admired about you before I knew all the other reasons I would come to love you." They remained in the clearing until the stars were fully visible overhead, planning their future with quiet excitement. The wedding would be small but joyful, held at the Double Z once the new store was operational and the Davenports could spare time away from Jerome. They would build a life together on the ranch, perhaps expanding the house as their family grew, creating a legacy that honored both their pasts while looking firmly toward the future. As they walked back to the main house, hand in hand beneath the star-filled sky, Fiona marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the devastating loss of the fire to the unexpected gift of love, each step, even the painful ones, had been necessary to lead her here, to this man and this future that now stretched before them, full of promise. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Fiona smiled up at him, her heart full. "That sometimes, out of the ashes of what we lose, we find something even more precious than what came before." He nodded, understanding, drawing her closer to his side as they walked. "And sometimes, what looks like an ending is really just the beginning of a much greater story." 3 months later, on a crisp autumn day with leaves turning gold on the cottonwoods, Fiona Davenport became Fiona Zimmerman in a ceremony attended by family and friends from both Jerome and the surrounding ranches. They exchanged vows beneath the oak tree by the creek, the spot where Caleb had proposed now decorated with wildflowers and ribbons for the occasion. George Davenport, walking steadily without his cane, gave his daughter away with tears of joy in his eyes. Margaret watched proudly as her daughter, radiant in a gown of ivory satin, pledged her life to the man who had appeared like a guardian angel in her darkest hour, Mrs. Rivera had outdone herself preparing for the celebration, with tables groaning under the weight of delicacies that would be talked about for years to come. Miguel had ensured the ranch was immaculate, the buildings freshly painted and the grounds perfectly maintained for the special day. Even Judge Patterson had made the journey from Prescott to perform the ceremony. remarking with satisfaction that it was a pleasure to preside over a union born from the pursuit of justice. "Some good should come from all that unpleasantness," he observed during the wedding feast, raising a glass to the happy couple. News had reached them a week before the wedding that Elliot Hargrove had been convicted of arson and fraud, sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison. The confirmation that justice had been served lifted the last shadow from their celebration, allowing them to focus entirely on the joyful beginning of their life together. As evening fell and lanterns were lit around the ranch yard for dancing, Caleb led his bride away from the festivities for a moment of quiet together. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist as they stood on the porch of what was now their home. Fiona leaned back against his chest, content in a way she had never imagined possible in those desperate days after the fire. "Completely," she assured him, "and grateful. For everything that brought us to this moment, even the difficult parts." "Especially the difficult parts," Caleb agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "They showed us who we truly are and what we could be together." From the yard came the sound of music and laughter, their guests enjoying the celebration that would continue well into the night. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of their married life, with all its promises and challenges, joys and occasional sorrows. But for now, in this perfect moment between what had been and what would be, they stood together in the fullness of love that had emerged from the ashes of loss, a love built on compassion, respect, and the profound understanding that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as our greatest trials. "We should return to our guests," Fiona said eventually, though she made no move to leave the circle of his arms. "In a minute," Caleb replied, turning her gently to face him. "I just want to look at you, Mrs. Zimmerman, to remember this moment exactly as it is." In his eyes, Fiona saw the reflection of their shared past and the bright promise of their future, a future that had seemed impossible in the aftermath of the fire that had taken everything she thought mattered, only to lead her to the man and the love that truly did. "I love you, Caleb Zimmerman," she whispered, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. "And I love you," he responded when they parted, "now and always." Hand in hand, they returned to the celebration, stepping into the next chapter of their story with hearts full of gratitude for the unexpected path that had brought them together. She, left by everyone after the fire. He, the cowboy who had brought blankets and a home and ultimately a love that would last a lifetime.